Hello, I'm Sender Dovching from School of Education, Curtin University. I would like to welcome you to a conversation series with Curtin School of Education. Today's conversation is with Professor Rhonda Oliver on the topic of her latest book, Indigenous Education in Australia, Learning and Teaching for Deadly Futures. So we welcome our Professor Rhonda Oliver. So I would like to give a brief introduction about Professor Rhonda Oliver. She is our head of School of Education at Curtin University. She has worked in the university sector since the early 90s. During this time, she has held various positions, including the director of 2 different research centers, head of research and higher degrees, and chair education. She was a director of research in the School of Education as well, and she has received nearly $2 million in research funding, either solely or as a member of a team. Now, Professor Rhonda Oliver has been a plenary speaker at a number of national and international conferences, and she has presented approximately 100 conference papers at local, national, mostly international conferences. She has also taught undergraduate and postgraduate students and successfully supervised more than 50 postgraduate students to completion. And she's very active in her research as well. Now I will say a few words about her research. Her research interests focus on studies of second language acquisition, and she's particularly interested in child learners, and more recently she has been involved in second language acquisition and the use of tasks for Indigenous learners in Australia. She has extensively published in international peer-reviewed journals such as Applied Linguistics, Modern Language Journal, Language Teaching Research, TESOL Quarterly. And she has also undertaken research in Indigenous and international students in the higher education sector, and she has just published her recent book, Indigenous Education in Australia, Learning and Teaching for Deadly Futures. So thanks for taking the time to join me today, Professor Rhonda.
Thank you, Sandra.
Yes. Now, before we start our conversation, I would like to introduce the book. Here's the book, and I think the book is very fascinating. It is essential practical resource for pre- and in-service educators on creating context for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And book has a lot of positive reviews, as you can see here, positive reviews. And one of the first one, the healing will come through our old people. These elders were shaped from the land we stand on. And it's their wisdom that will allow teachers to seek the truth within themselves. Then that makes this book a true teaching tool, one that can perhaps shape the one word that we will all seek, belonging. Buri Monty Prior, an award-winning author. Okay, so the book has 15 chapters, right? 15 chapters, and it was, of course, co-edited with Marnie Shea. And all the contributors and authors are from all diverse backgrounds, and especially Aboriginal background researchers and educators. Now, I want to start with the book title, because when you release your book, the first question came from people, especially from colleagues. What do you mean by deadly? Why deadly is the main title of the book? So can you please explain to us why Deadly Futures?
It was actually, I got a lot of responses on social media around this. Some of my colleagues, particularly in North America, were worried what I was going to be doing in Indigenous classrooms. But in Aboriginal English, the word deadly means very good. It's good. It's what it's deadly. So it's a good thing. And we really wanted to change the narrative from a deficit view of Indigenous education to one which is positive, that there is modelling around the potential of Aboriginal students. And we've done this throughout the book. Marnie Shea is the first editor and I'm the second. She's Aboriginal and I'm clearly non-Aboriginal. And together we wanted to show how things can be done in a positive and collaborative way, not only in our publication but in education more generally.
That's very interesting because you kind of use the Aboriginal English word as a book title, and it's kind of decolonizing the whole practice, knowledge practice in academia by using the Aboriginal English word as a title, which is very fascinating for everyone. So I had to check the Aboriginal English dictionary. What does deadly mean, And it says fantastic, great, super, right?
It's deadly. It's
good. It's good. Yeah. Okay, that's great. My next question was about basically you've mentioned a lot about the strength-based research approach, right? So in that one, from my understanding, because I went, I read your book, and there were authors sharing their personal and professional experiences, providing rich examples for readers to learn from. And when I read the book, some chapters seemed to me, yes, some chapters are based on strength-based approach, but it seemed to me more like autobiographical in a sense, where authors write about themselves from memory, and then they explore and share their experiences. But some chapters also seem to be very ethnographic in a sense, where it evokes and represents the culture experience in a way that gives readers the sense that they were with those authors. So I felt like I was walking beside these authors. I felt like I was believing in these authors. I felt like thoughts and feelings and experiences are shared with me, creating and evoking this empathy. So I really wanted to know better about the research methods and approach, and you call it strength-based approach in the book. But for me, it was also reminded me of also ethnographies as well, which is also emerging in applied linguistics lately. So can you tell us about your research methods, the strength-based research, and so forth?
Well, thank you for that. It's very much a strength-based approach. The narrative, as I mentioned before, has been one of creating Aboriginal students in a deficit construction, and we really wanted to overcome that. Aboriginal students from a great range of backgrounds bring a diversity of experiences, knowledge, understanding and skills to learning, and we wanted to build upon that rather than having this notion that they are in some way lesser. And so it was really about building upon what they bring to school in a positive way, in a strength-based way. And the way we could do this is that all our authors have rich experiences working in Aboriginal communities, working in classrooms with a high number of Aboriginal learners. And so that autoethnography that you read into it, Sandra, is because they really were their experiences. We wanted to make it accessible, particularly, but not only for undergraduates, so that they could, if you like, really get a sense of the classroom. And they did that because they could talk about their experiences. And some of the chapters are perhaps more theoretical, but again, they've been written by Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people with a real experience in this field, so that we could work together and build upon the strength of the learners themselves, working with them around what they want to know, what they need to learn, and what will set them up for strong and positive futures.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And you've used a lot of new terms I think these terms are very thought-provoking, at least for me. For example, you use terms like co-creating methodology, co-creating teaching experience. You also used the critical reflection and so forth. So I think that's the part of the strength-based research approach, is that
it is, and it is about co-creating the classroom and what's to be learned. And there's some really good chapters around that. Sarah and Ewing and Armour and Miller talk about how this can be done. I actually didn't come from an Aboriginal education background. My field, as you mentioned, has a lot to do with second language acquisition. And I was originally what used to be called an ESL teacher and now an EALD teacher. And some of my early career as an academic was working with a man called Mike Breen, and he developed a particular approach, the process approach within the task-based language teaching. And his idea was it was actually the negotiation of the curriculum rather than the teaching and learning itself that a lot of the positive things came out of. And it was interesting to see that notion of co-construction being used in a positive way with Aboriginal students. And it really helps to get them into learning, because we often hear that the curriculum isn't relevant. And it's because we're not consulting with the learners themselves. So bringing them into co-constructing the curriculum, it's motivating. It's also more relevant. You know, I often talk about the panda example and going out to a remote school and a lovely and well-meaning teacher doing a lesson around animals adapting to their environment and helping to overcome the environmental damage and the risk for these species in the future. And I'm sitting in this remote community looking out at this wonderful desert in the background, and the animal he chose was pandas. And to this day, I'm still struck by how inappropriate that was. But also he wasn't building on the strength of those students. There was so much that they could have brought to that experience, but they weren't. They weren't involved in it. The decisions were being made by the teacher alone, and yet they had so much to offer in that experience. So, you know, it's building from that base, and also the communities themselves. A lot of the book is around relationships and Aboriginal identity, and who better to help teachers achieve this than communities, the parents of the students, the families of the students, and the whole community as a way of getting in a really rich and helpful resource for supporting these students as they go. So that's what the co-creation, it's beyond just the classroom walls.
Yes. So it's also one way of, I think, decolonizing the discourse and discursive practices, I think, in the scholarship of Aboriginal education, involving Aboriginal participants as much as possible and basically work together. So I think another main topic in your book was supporting the diverse language background of Aboriginal people in Australia. So, for example, in chapter number 8 was supporting the diverse language background of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So it really struck me because for me, when I read this chapter, the linguistic diversity, especially the translanguaging practices, seem to be like a norm, ordinary practice for these Aboriginal students. But, you know, in our in applied linguistic and traditional applied linguistic scholarship, this linguistic diversity, translanguaging and so forth, they are often treated as extraordinary, abnormal, or they are often treated as something unconventional, as if, we're sort of like into this intellectual fetishism or exoticization of different linguistic varieties. But when I read your chapters, it seemed to me that, actually these linguistic diversity and translanguaging practices are one of those very ordinary practices for Aboriginal students. So how do you actually, what do you say about this? How do you support these linguistically different background students? What do you say about their translanguaging practices?
Again, it actually relates to the strength-based philosophy that we have underpinning the book. Aboriginal students do come with a range of languages, and I have to caution here that all Aboriginal students are different in many ways. So some will come to class with Standard Australian English as their home language. Other will come speaking a traditional language or a Creole as their first language. It varies across the nation. One thing we know is that Aboriginal people speaking to each other will often use Aboriginal English as their lingua franca, so they'll use that to communicate. So children growing up in that environment will slide between their different languages according to audience and according to appropriacy. So it is just an ordinary practice for them, although as someone who doesn't have Aboriginal English as their second dialect, I find it extraordinary to watch very young children being able to move fluidly between their languages and use their repertoire in ways that enhances their learning. And I think that's what we need to take from this, is that in fact as educators we should build on what they have as their foundation rather than trying to impose outside. a different chapter, and actually not in this book, but done with some colleagues. We talked about how translanguaging is new, unfortunately, to a lot of practices, and in the past we had very much the colonial view, where students were told to leave their languages at the gate, not to build upon the strength that they already had. And that's so sad, because they can make such strong connections when they can bring language from home into the classroom. Of course, there should be opportunities for input around standard Australian English, because it is a standard. It means that it's the language that's closest to written text, and it does help their literacy practices. But so does making connections in your home language. So it shouldn't be extraordinary. It should be part of ordinary practice to build on what the students already have. So, that was a key part. The other thing about languages is it's so important to your culture and identity. And if you have that strength of understanding who you are and where you come from, then you actually have an opportunity to make really positive learning. If we try to ignore that part of who they are, part of their core identity, then we're really setting them up for failure.
Yes. This is why I think it's important to look at linguistic diversity, not only in Aboriginal language education, but also in migrants, in like multilingual country like Australia. We should go beyond seeking to understand the extraordinaries, but it's actually ordinary linguistic practices. Okay, thank you so much, Rhonda. And how do you see the future of Indigenous education in Australia?
Well, we have a long way to go. There's an enormous amount of work to do, but there's also been some great achievements. For me, I think awareness is the first step, and Auntie Denise Proud, one of our authors, and her colleague Morgan talk about some of the critical self-reflection that's needed. So I think this is not necessarily on behalf of the learners, but in fact on the teachers, being aware what students have when they bring to school. If I go back to the panda example, those students would know how to catch a goanna, how to round it up, if you like, and also how to cook and eat it in a way. Why don't we build upon what they have and bring? I think it's really important that we don't judge. So often the deficit constructions that I talked about is based on teachers' lack of awareness and lack of understanding what students already know. In my own experience as a non-Aboriginal person, I remember being a young teacher, and I heard teachers sitting around the staff room talking about a student, and of course they wouldn't do well because they came from a single-parent family. Now, this was the 80s, and society in Australia changed a great deal, and it was new to have so many single-parent families. This judgment was being made based on the marital status of a child. And now we look back at that and horrified of that. I mean, I was horrified at the time. I remember saying, well, we should be careful not to judge too quickly. I came from a single-parent family and I did okay. We need to do the same with Aboriginal students, not to stereotype, not to set up understandings that we don't quite understand from a non-Aboriginal perspective, but by working with communities and parents and the students themselves, developing our own awareness. I've certainly learned a lot more from students than I've ever taught them. And that's true not just for Aboriginal students, but for students from a lot of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So I think it's being open and being willing to learn. And I think we need to put this into our practices in classrooms. I heard a wonderful quote from one of our on-country teachers. This is a program we have in our School of Education where we're helping Aboriginal assistants to become fully qualified teachers. And one of our participants was sitting during a lesson and she got very angry listening to some of the assessments that were being made. And she said, you know, the problem is they keep judging black kids using white sticks. And I think there's so much to learn from that in terms of our curriculum and assessment practices, that we need to think about what these students have. One of my colleagues, Gillian Wigglesworth, has written a number of papers showing that some of those high-stake assessment procedures, such as NAPLAN, they come with a whole lot of cultural underpinnings that just don't apply to everyone. Just the same as an Aboriginal student working in the Kimberley, living and working and studying in the Kimberley is going to be different from an Aboriginal student in Sydney. So too those tests are very different for a non-Aboriginal student in the leafy green suburbs of Perth compared to a student in Alice Springs, and yet we're using the one test to test all of them. It's fraught, and we really need to be thinking about how we do that better in the future. We also need to look at our practices. So we have students coming to school and we're teaching them as if they're special needs. They're not. They're Aboriginal with a rich and extensive cultural background, but we're using methods that were designed, direct instruction to be specific, that's not appropriate for students. They just come from a different background. They're not special needs. So be, very careful, be aware of what's happening, and I hope that our book will make it very clear what's necessary. And if I had a take-home message for everyone, it's about respecting cultural difference and linguistic diversity and understanding that we don't all necessarily start at the same point, but there's nothing to stop us from going forward. And if I've learnt something, that high expectations and treating people with respect can lead to success.
That's great, Rhonda. Thank you so much. So how can we raise the public awareness, Rhonda? What do you think?
There's a long way to go, and I think we need to be critical consumers of the media, that there's a lot of things that are done with good intent, but there's an unconscious bias that exists. So we have to be really careful about how we view, and also how the media represents, in particular, Aboriginal cultures, that we need to understand that, one, they're not a homogeneous group, that within Aboriginal community there's a great range. And at the same time, we need to respect difference and diversity and recognise that because we're different, it doesn't make us less. And so I think the media has a role, but I think teachers as the people with which change in society can happen need to represent these views. And, a way to do that is again, some of the messages that we have in the book: developing awareness, respecting identity, respecting culture, being aware, working collaboratively and in a co-constructed way, and not having this colonial view that our way is the right way and we must do as we're told and then everything will be okay, because we've seen that intergenerational trauma that's come from past policies in this way.
Okay. So being different is about being same. So the sameness of difference, the ordinariness of diversity seems to be very important for this discussion, I think. And thank you so much for your conversation, Rhonda. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much.